This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I'm holding this fine new title in my hands, this new book called Accountable, The Rise of Citizen Capitalism. My guest today, Michael O'Leary, is the author of this new book. And I don't know how you can get into this subject without getting controversial. At least some people are going to love you and some people are going to hate you. Michael argues that corporations are broken. No deeper purpose than profit. Now, some people might disagree with that little statement right there, but that's the whole point of this podcast. Let's get it out there and let's have a little bit of an intellectual joust. Michael makes the case that if corporations can be accountable to a deeper purpose, we can make capitalism both prosperous and good. Again, just with this simple setup, I'm sure I've got half the audience going yes and half the audience going no. But that's why I love doing this podcast. Let's get us all out there in the thinking circle and let's debate it. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Michael O'Leary. I'm thinking about the idea of a corporation. I happen to have one. It happens to be a C corporation. And I don't know the structure of Amazon's corporate structure. It's probably quite complicated. But in a nutshell, if I had to take myself back to the mid-1990s when I set up a corporation and Jeff Bezos set up one, he's had a touch more success than me. He's done a little bit better. But at the root level, we both thought, for assorted reasons, okay, let's set up a corporate structure. Maybe we talk to our CPAs, whatever, and we start running business through it. Jeff's gets bigger than mine, but I have one. I've lived with it. I know what it is, and I see the benefits. But it's something that myself and other shareholders, it's ours. It's ours. We do what we want to with it. I mean, I don't really have any responsibility with my particular corporation other than what I need to do or what I see fit to do. Now, things might change, of course, when you get to be an Amazon, and I heard they're buying a 100-acre swath of land in Loudoun County, Virginia, near where I grew up, to build a data farm. I mean, things get more complicated. Let's start with this basic idea. How do you feel about the idea of setting up a corporation today? Is this still something that is good, is wise, is useful for society?
There are folks in this movement, the broader movement to reform capitalism, to be more responsible, to be more sustainable. There are folks in this movement who I think would rather have an economy made up entirely of small worker co-ops, all local business. There's the poet, philosopher.
I got to stop you. I know what a corporation is. I don't know what a small worker co-op is. If I don't want to be involved with somebody else, why do I have to be involved with them?
I think that's exactly it. There's a reason why the corporate form is not just dominant in the United States, but it's dominant the world over. And it's not just been dominant since you started a company in the 90s. It's been dominant for 200, 300 years. And that is because when you think about it takes risk and capital to build a business. So you take something like limited liability, which we now take for granted, that companies have limited liability, which means that they can never be liable for more damages than the value of the company. You can't go after shareholders and say, you're invested in this tobacco company, and therefore, even though your stock has been wiped out, we're going to take even more money from you because of all the damages you've caused. Now, I think we take it for granted that something like limited liability exists, but there was a time before limited liability. And the reason why the government created the corporate form that included things like limited liability is because that helps get capital off the sidelines. It helps get people to take risks, build companies that ultimately become businesses like Amazon that transform the world, transform our lives. I think there's people in this movement who would say corporations with shareholders are so focused on profits. We'd rather have what I said earlier, a worker co-op, a tiny business that is owned by its workers, where the workers each have an equal say in the direction of the company. And in the book, Accountable, that I wrote with Warren Valdmanis, we try to take a realist view of these sorts of things and recognize that we'll never have an economy built entirely of small worker co-ops. That might be what the economy looked like in 1776 when Adam Smith is writing Wealth of Nations, but that is not what the economy looks like today. And when we think about what can we do to make capitalism better reflect our values, it can't be to throw out the corporation.
Keep me at this worker co-op idea. I know from experience trying to put a company together all those years ago, started with 4 people, ended up with 1 person. There's not really an equal desire when it comes to being an entrepreneur, to putting money at risk. You see all kinds of types of desires, but you definitely don't see equal desire. You don't see equal determination, equal drive by any stretch of the imagination. So I guess when I see statements like no purpose deeper than profit, I mean, for my company, that's what the company does. It searches for profit. Now, when I have those profits, I could do something else with them and something nice with them. But in terms of what the company's objective is, it's profit. Is that idea bad in your mind?
I think a lot of the writers in this movement, a lot of the people who try and frame this debate, will go back to 1970 when Milton Friedman wrote an article for the New York Times titled, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Maximize its Profits." His idea was essentially that corporations are owned by shareholders, whether that's owned by a single shareholder or owned by tens of millions of shareholders worldwide. Corporations are owned by their shareholders, which means that the responsibility of their executives is to serve the shareholders' interests. And the way he defined those interests, and I think the way a lot of people would define those interests, is very in line to what you just said, which is, why would a shareholder be invested other than to make profit? Serving shareholders' interests must mean maximizing profits. Now, I look back at that, it's 50 years ago this fall. I look back at that article, I think Milton Friedman was wrong, but for the right reasons. I flip that every time. Milton Friedman was wrong for the right reasons. It was the right reasons in that corporations are owned by shareholders. They should reflect the interests and the values of those shareholders. But he's wrong that those interests stop with profit. So I think if you look at small business owners, intimately know their community, intimately involved in the lives of their workers, they don't take those obligations lightly. For a small business owner, if they pollute their local river, it's their river they're polluting. If they fire with their workers, it's their neighbors or their neighbors' kids that they're firing. All the decisions they make around profit are embedded within a deeper value system.
Real quick, the polluting, okay, we generally have laws, even if some business owner is a jerk and he does it, we generally have laws. But the second part you said there was if they fire. Well, fire is not necessarily a bad thing.
You take someone like Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett has invested in a lot of businesses that have grown their employee base over time. He's invested in businesses that have become more productive by firing their employees over time. You ask him, what is the beauty of capitalism, of the American economic system? He says it's to become more productive all the time. I am not advocating that we have a French system where it's much more difficult to fire, and as a result, companies are much more lethargic to hire employees out of the fear they'd never be able to fire them if things went south. But I think what you're seeing now is a greater emphasis on businesses that treat their employees less like line items to be minimized on an income statement and more like assets to be invested in. I should frame all this by saying that things can be true about corporate strategy, investing strategy today that were not true 20 or 30 years ago. That it might be that the best way to build a business 20 or 30 years ago was not to focus so much on diversity and inclusion or having anti-racist employee policies, but it might be that today that's the sort of thing that you need to acquire, retain, motivate talent, to have a consumer base that really values what you're doing. A big thesis behind our writing, behind Accountable.
One thing really quick. Obviously, that's going to end up being highly political because in a way, what you just said is if the company doesn't have the values, which could be, okay, are they liberal? Are they conservative? If the company doesn't have the values and the social media mob gets riled up enough, they're going to use that mob power to say, I'm not buying the Goya food.
Right. Or another recent example would be the Washington Redskins. The owner for how many years said, I'm not changing the name, I'm not changing the name. And then ultimately, when there's enough pressure from your stakeholders, from your fans, from your advertisers, there's enough pressure, eventually you succumb. I think this is a good point, though, because you also have cases on the left and the right. So you have cases like Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A that are driven by a different set of values than the coastal liberal set that I think a lot of people point to. One of the, I don't know if you call it a risk or the inevitability of bringing more values into business is that you're going to bring in more conflict. But here's the important thing. I look at a case like Wayfair, the furniture retailer in Boston, online furniture retailer. They discovered Wayfair was selling $200,000 of bedroom furniture to these detention centers on the border during the immigration crisis a year or two ago. And the employees went into an uproar. And management said, well, we're not really a political organization. Our job is to sell to any legal buyer. And I think there's a debate to be had about if you care about these detention centers, should you sell them furniture or should you not sell them furniture? But I don't think there's a debate that their employees are demanding this to be a value-laden decision. And for management to try and hide behind this idea that markets are amoral, that the invisible hand solves these things, that the political arena or the moral arena are right, not the economic arena, to discuss these things, I think that's a bygone era. And today, especially of the younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, I'm right in the middle of the millennial generation. My co-author is a Gen Xer. I think within generations, you're seeing a change, but especially across generations, you're just seeing a different set of expectations being put on our corporations.
Let's look at it this way. Let's take it to its potential end. Do we have a situation where I walk into the grocery store and foods are labeled as conservative and liberal?
No.
Tell me that's not impossible. Or to take it a step further, can I find out exactly who the companies are, because I'm going to look on the back of my box of cereal and it's going to tell me what percentage of diversity this company has. So when you buy that particular food, you'll know, was that food made by a quote white company or a black company or a Latino company, et cetera. I mean, are we headed to that direction?
If you go on Yelp today, this is the last time I checked it earlier this week, you can search specifically. There's a banner at the top to search specifically for Black-owned businesses. I don't think we're headed there. I think we are there in many cases. For a long time, we've had things like certified organic. Now we're trending into things like non-GMO or fair trade certified. We also have designations now, like the B Corp designation. We were talking about the corporate form earlier. There's some changes to the legal form that are being suggested, but there's also some certifications by independent bodies, like the B Corp certification, where a company can go, fills out this long survey on how it treats its workers, what policies does it have, what's its environmental impacts. And at the end of it, if it scores above a certain threshold, it gets a B Corp certification. And you can now see that label on a whole lot of products, most of whom are small startups still growing, but some large companies, the Patagonias of the world, the Whole Foods of the world, now part of Amazon, to your earlier example. These are businesses that are built on these sets of values and trying to display them. It's not quite the Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, but it sure is focused on things like worker rights, environmental sustainability. The health impacts has always been important. And I think those things are just growing in saliency in consumers' minds. And as a result, I think this is something that business leaders and ultimately investors ignore at their peril.
I can't help but think when I ponder the idea of labels and products and services being labeled, that at a bad point in time in the history of America, we had something called separate but equal. It does feel like, now I guess, look, if companies by their free will want to go to the market and say all of these particular values, which are often just political planks, or they want to label themselves with a certain identity, I guess as long as government is not pushing it, I guess that's everyone's right. I just wonder, from your perspective, do you think if we get to that logical conclusion of where we might be going, where everything has this kind of a label structure, and it feels, you mentioned Chick-fil-A. I mean, I think everyone knows, at least I've never eaten at Chick-fil-A just because I haven't been in the States recently, but I think Chick-fil-A is owned by a conservative owner. So does that mean I don't want to use Chick-fil-A services food if I'm a liberal voter? Or likewise, I believe Fred Smith at FedEx is conservative. I could be wrong. But I mean, do we start to go down is that the path we're headed? And is it a good thing?
Well, it's funny because you frame this a little bit as repoliticizing business. I think I would frame it slightly differently. I might say we have a set of values that governs our lives. It governs the way we interact with our families, our communities, our churches, our places of worship, and it governs the way we vote. For a long time, for at least the last half century, it's governed everything we do except for one, which is our economic lives. With a great example being Harvard. Right now, there's a big movement within Harvard for the university to divest its endowment from fossil fuel stocks. And Harvard's argument is We as a university care so much about fighting climate change. We fight it through our research and through who we hire and our teaching. But the purpose of the endowment is to maximize returns, risk-adjusted returns, to fund all of those other aspects. So essentially, the Harvard University is saying, we have a set of values that governs everything we do, but one, which is the way we invest.
Of course, that makes no sense.
I would say we have divorced our economic from our moral lives. And what's happening now is we're not politicizing the economic sphere, reuniting our economic and moral lives so that the same values that are governing the way we vote, for instance, are now also governing the way we shop, the way we invest, where we choose to work. I think this employee activism example from Wayfair, that is not a single example. We see this at places like Amazon. We've seen it at a lot of tech companies where tech workers have a lot of power within the organization, and they're pushing their companies, whether it's Facebook, New York Times, you're seeing with the way the reporters were able to force a lot of personnel changes there. You're seeing employees demanding of their employers to take stands on some of these issues. Honestly, I'll say I think part of it is because they feel so stymied in the political sphere. And so why is it that now suddenly we're thinking about all the power we have as economic actors? I think it's because people are feeling like we're not making enough traction. You think about something like climate change or pricing carbon. Should we put a tax on carbon? There's a report a couple of months ago from the Department of Energy, which in an otherwise unnotable report referred to natural gas as freedom gas, to carbon fuels as molecules of US freedom, something like that. Not quite the prelude to a carbon tax. If you really care about climate change, fighting climate change, and you're a student at Harvard University, you're going to start saying, well, maybe I can force my university to do something about this, and the endowment might be a good place to start.
I think that's perfectly acceptable. I think the parts that start to scare me when I think that profit can be labeled as something bad, I'm not saying you're necessarily saying it like that. That's my choice of words. But I think when you go down the path of the individual entrepreneur is labeled as a bad guy for pursuing profit, okay, that's someone's free right to do that. And if groups want to organize to do that, that's fine. The part that really frightens me is that if we get to the point where we create this entire massive new bureaucracy, and I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America exist around Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, because that's where all the federal jobs are, and they have the big pensions, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that if we go down these kinds of paths, it doesn't become something where we create new sources of government power to enforce this type of situation. And the second part to my thought here, which is not necessarily connected exactly to that, so people don't think I'm trying to be only a von Mises or a Friedman guy only, or an Ayn Rand guy. The reality is, in our day and age today, I mean, with something like zero interest rate policy, this isn't capitalism by any definition that I know. The Fed is using a lever to move stocks up and down well beyond market force. I don't want you to think that you're not blind to the fact that what's going on doesn't look like capitalism in the old Friedman definition ways.
I've always been a student of history, and especially in researching the book, we went back and looked at things like the corporate form. Where did the corporate form come from? I think you'll enjoy this. You go back to the early stages of American history, late 18th century, early 19th century. If you wanted to form a corporation, you had to go to your state legislature and ask for the privilege. And in fact, they put in the Articles of Incorporation, they would require you to say, what social purpose is your corporation meant to serve? In other words, we're giving you all these privileges of limited liability, of transferable shares. Why should we grant that privilege upon your entity? And so you'd get things like a Granite Railway Company in Massachusetts would say, well, society needs more granite on the coasts, and we've got this mine in the center of the Commonwealth. Let us build a railroad with a corporate form so we can meet that growing social need. And the reason why they got rid of that process where you had to go to the state legislature, and why instead it turned into what you can do now, which is essentially anyone can form a corporation for any reason, is because it did lead to all this bureaucracy. It led to things were log jammed in legislatures. All these special favors would be going out. Would you, because you're trying to start a company, that it would be a rival of another company that has a connection to the legislature, would they then deny your application? There's, I think, a real risk that if you put government in charge of deciding which purposes are deemed permissible versus which ones aren't, that you can end up making a bigger problem than you're trying to solve. In the book, we very clearly went through in a chapter on what role does government play in this, because I think there's a lot of people who agree with our general critiques of capitalism, that many companies have become too focused on quarterly earnings on short-term profits, not only at the expense of communities, workers, the environment, but even at the expense of their own long-term prosperity as a company. There's a lot of people in this movement who would say, well, why can't government solve it? Why can't we just pass a series of laws that would require corporations to be good? We go through examples like the proposals to limit share buybacks, for instance, or the decades-long quest to try and limit executive compensation, and look at what are the cases where government is useful versus what are the cases where government, as in, at least we argue for executive compensation, has created more harm than good in trying to solve what ultimately we think is kind of a superficial problem, where if we could just solve the governance problem of shareholders electing boards, appointing CEOs, if we could solve that system so that the interests and the values of shareholders are actually being represented, which I think does not include kind of outrageous corporate executive compensation for CEOs who are not delivering value, we wouldn't need government to step in all these ways. It's the failure to do that in the private markets, I think, is requiring the government to step in places where I think some people get queasy.
How is that line you just phrased it, though? If the corporate leader is not doing X, Y, Z, there was a lot of subjective interpretation in the way you just phrased that. Ultimately, if we all go to DC and we look behind the scenes, congressional offices, I don't care what side of the aisle, these are not our most impressive people. They are not. These are people that have learned how to get votes over the course of their life, and they exist in DC. DC is one of the most inefficient places. Federal offices in the DC area are beyond inefficient compared to anything in the corporate world. I sometimes wonder that if we make a real mistake, that the average American voter, who might not be wanting to take a risk in their life, maybe they're just happy getting the job. If you're just happy getting the job, you kind of get what you get in a way. I just wonder about the personal responsibility here. We all want to dream that there's a magic good person in DC to solve it all for us, and we don't have to do anything, really. We can just get a job, and there's going to be some magic Jeff Bezos, and he'll take care of us. When I see the rise of citizen capitalism, I just wonder, how much effort do the citizens really want to take beyond saying, I'm not going to buy that food because I don't like that CEO?
Yeah. The trend that I've been following that I refer to as the billionaire cop-out, which is that anytime these broad social problems come up, whether it's gun violence or climate change or stagnating wages, that these billionaires, the Ray Dalios of the world, the Jamie Dimons of the world, they'll come out, they'll issue a long white paper calling on government to do more. It feels a little too convenient to call on the one most historically, notoriously log-jammed institution to make changes when business leaders themselves already have power to make progress on these issues. And let me give you an example, which is every time we have an instance of mass violence, gun violence, a mass shooting, every time we have an instance of a mass shooting in America, business leaders will step up and say, we need legislation. But after the Parkland shooting, Walmart, Dick's Sporting Goods, the business leaders of these companies said, yes, we need legislation. This is something the government could or should be acting on. But we also play a role in this because we decide what products we sell. To finish that anecdote, and they decided we're going to stop selling assault rifles. In the case of Dick's Sporting Goods, not only did they stop selling it, they didn't even return them back to the manufacturer. They melted them down so there'd be fewer assault rifles out there in society. And that was entirely driven by a sense of values. I think it was not bad policy on a business strategy front, because I think that's probably what a lot of their consumers and many of their employees would have expected from them. And I think about businesses like CVS is the final example I'll bring up here. Tobacco, been legislating around tobacco for half a century. CVS says we want to be more of a health company. We want our consumers to trust us with their health decisions. And yet we're selling tobacco behind the counter. And so they went through and they made the decision, we're going to stop selling tobacco across any of our stores, which is a hard decision because at the time, a lot of their competitors, the dollar stores that were all taking share, they had just started selling tobacco. And sure enough, when CVS made this decision, quarterly merchandise sales fell by 8%. But ultimately, if they're trying to think about how do I maximize my brand equity, how do I maximize the goodwill and commitment and trust my customers have in me, these sorts of things that actually determine long-term success of a brand like CVS, I think this is how you do it. And they were able to measure that as a result of their action, 100 million fewer packs of cigarettes were sold, not by CVS, but overall, people bought 100 million fewer packs of cigarettes because of that action. I'm very attuned to this fear that as values enter the marketplace, is that akin to political determinations. And I think one thing I take heart in knowing is that ultimately we as consumers, employees, shareholders get to make these decisions. And managers, the CEO, is tasked with trying to balance out these conflicting demands from stakeholders. If they're paid well for anything, it should be doing that well. But ultimately, corporations are not unaccountable. They are accountable to their shareholders and accountable to the forces of capitalism as dictated by where people want to work and where people want to shop.
You bring up gun violence, and it's an interesting situation. I believe that if a company like Dick's feels a certain pressure from their community, their clients, their stakeholders, their shareholders, look, whatever they want to do, I support that. Why not? If someone's going to be really honest about this, they have to say, well, gosh, sure. And same with CVS. If CVS doesn't want to sell tobacco, I don't smoke. I think smoking's disgusting. I don't care whether you're smoking a cigarette, a pipe, weed, or cigar. I mean, we all know it's crap for us, period. We all know it. We know it. If you say you enjoy it, that's fine. I respect that too. Just don't blow the stuff in my face. So here's the thing from the guns, which really gets to me, because the way you framed it, and you brought up Dick's and you brought up the school shootings, and this is something that happens at irregular moments in time. It clearly happens. I mean, we're probably due for another one of these terrible situations by now. However, if I looked at right now, and if let's say there was a school shooting, we're in an election year for a presidential election, and let's say there was a school shooting and the kid was using another assault rifle type gun of some sort, and he kills a lot of kids. Man, that would be just pushed on CNN nonstop. And it would be pushed against the right, and it would be pushed against the Second Amendment. But on the flip side, in the last 3 months, there's no outcry at all in inner city America that kids are just getting popped left and right, left and right. It does look like a hypocrisy. It does look like a double standard, because if this was covered in an election year as extensively as it should be, it would hurt the left, because this is occurring in left cities. The word values and politics, it gets all mixed up, and I don't want anybody killing anybody. I don't want anybody in inner cities killing each other. I don't want kids at schools killing each other. But damn it, there sure seems to be a hell of a lot of hypocrisy in this.
Gun violence in this country is a tragedy in all those scenarios that you described. I couldn't agree with you more. And making these things political, I think is a real travesty on both sides, because I think most people can agree that some sort of sensible regulation, legislation moving forward on these things would be more likely if we didn't make it such a political talking point. I think the thing that's interesting for me, I've spent some time working in government, but my expertise, the book really focuses on the role that companies, corporations, investors play in this. I think the point that's interesting for me to think through is on a lot of issues like gun companies, but I think especially now people talk about this in terms of oil and gas companies, is that if you care about this issue, you should not own the stock. That it's somehow immoral. If you care about climate change, it's immoral to profit off of climate change by owning a share of ExxonMobil. And the same goes for gun manufacturers.
I support that. Look, if the individual people out there that invest, whether it's their pensions or their retirement accounts or whatever, if they want to make a decision that they're going to pursue their mutual fund companies to divest, I would be disingenuous if I said I didn't support that, because that's their free right to do it.
The interesting thing we're starting to see, though, is we're starting to see shareholder activism on these issues. So people who, instead of saying, I'm going to divest from this company, instead, I'm going to use my power as a shareholder to push change. So if you look at shareholder resolutions that are filed at annual meetings each year, you've seen a meteoric rise in resolutions that are related to these sorts of environmental, social, governance, ESG factors. Some things that are very political like this, other things that are something closer to this company should disclose how much it spends on lobbying, kind of base level disclosures. And right now, a lot of those proposals are failing because, in my view, a lot of the investors who care most about these issues are instead taking the tack of divesting rather than engaging. So if I had to predict, I would say looking forward, we're going to see more of these debates happening within companies, within boardrooms, within shareholder bases. This is an area where the shareholder democracy that exists in the corporate form, one share, one vote, is actually really beautiful because it allows you to take these very values-driven decisions and have a debate and then let the shareholders vote. If the shareholders vote to push ExxonMobil to start shifting towards renewable energy and away from some of their drilling projects, that's what the shareholders get to decide. I think exactly to your point. You can't purely on free choice, let the economy roll grounds, this is exactly how things are supposed to operate in a capitalist economy. And I think where things have broken down is that right now we have a lot of shareholders who have a certain set of values around these issues, and those values are not being transmitted through our complicated, intermediated financial system to the board and ultimately to corporate strategy.
You had an example. I don't recall how you phrased it exactly, but it was with the newspaper Gannett and USA Today. What was that example again? Can you explain that one to my audience?
Yes, the newspaper industry, for those who haven't been following it closely, has been undergoing a fair amount of turmoil, mostly driven by a loss of advertising revenue and a loss of subscribers. Keep that in mind as I describe the context here, that if you look back to 1990 to today, roughly half the newspaper subscriptions in America have fallen away. And if you look at newspapers as a share of advertising revenue, you can go back to early 1900s, they started losing share the moment radio took off and billboards and ultimately the internet. Keep all that in mind. That's the context here. But what was happening in the newspaper industry is there's a few hedge funds, a few financial buyers who've been going around rolling up newspapers. So one, Digital First Media, owned by a hedge fund, Alden Global Capital, they became somewhat notorious because their way of helping their newspapers to survive was by gutting newsroom staff, cutting down to the bone where the critics would put it. They put in a large offer to acquire Gannett. Gannett owns USA Today. It owns dozens and dozens of other papers across the country. And when they put an offer to buy Gannett, Gannett initially rebuffed them. And they said, okay, well, instead we'll have a proxy war for board elections. Alden Global Capital, they nominated their board electors. Gannett nominated their own slate of board members. And it was going to be decided at the meeting. It was incredible to watch because there was protests out in front of Alden's headquarters. You had senators like the senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, writing tweets about how Alden Global Capital is bad for democracy, bad for America. But ultimately, shareholders get to decide. Gannett made their case. Alden made their case. The incredible thing is for the book, I went down to the meeting. I don't know if you've ever been to a shareholder meeting for one of these Fortune 500 companies. There's somewhat lackluster affairs. This vote could determine how news is delivered to millions and millions and millions of Americans. This vote could determine the futures of hundreds or thousands of reporters who work at USA Today and all the other papers that Gannett owns. And yet in the room, when they asked, do any shareholders want to make a comment or ask a question, exactly one shareholder was there and stood up. And to me, what that reflects is that right now we think about the power we have as voters, for sure, as protesters, yes. We think about the power we might have as consumers often. We don't often think about the power we have as shareholders. Most of us own our shares through companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. And I could not tell you how Vanguard voted on most of these proposals at all the different companies I own through mutual funds and ETFs and all of that. What ended up happening to Gannett was the current board prevailed. They pushed back the offer from Alden. They lived to see another day. And the reason they were able to do so is because the big institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street ended up supporting the existing board. But they did so not because they necessarily knew that's what we as the ultimate investors, the ultimate shareholders wanted or cared about. They did so because that's what their kind of internal governance teams decides. And I think that represents kind of the separation, the distance that exists in our financial system that is slowly falling away. As you see all the flows into environmental, social, ESG ETFs, there's now $12 trillion that's invested in funds like that, up fourfold over the last decade. I think you're seeing people start to recognize that my value should be expressed in my investments, and that shows up as much in the boardroom of Gannett as anywhere else.
I got to give you credit, and I'm not picking on you when I say this, but you said, my values. That seems very particular as a replacement for politics.
Well, it depends. Do you think your values drive your politics?
I'm saying the way you use the word values sounds like I'm trying to figure out what the difference is. Is values, and again, I'm being highly respectful here, is values the new way to not say politics?
Well, I studied moral philosophy as an undergraduate, so I think I probably bleed into the moral philosophy more than most in the financial industry. For me, here's the way I would think about it. I would say we have some set of values that governs our lives, some set of values about how important is it to support American workers, as opposed to, is it more important to support global development and support workers in Vietnam or Indonesia? I've got a set of values around that, buy American or not.
To stop here a second, as far as I understand, Nike's making all of their shoes in Vietnam and China. So we're not exactly supporting American workers.
No, but I think you're seeing a lot of companies that are trying to be built off of this idea that we do invest in the local workforce. I mean, look at Amazon right now. Amazon, I'll give it to you. This is in the political arena that this is coming up because they're trying to build new facilities. They're trying to get subsidies and tax credits and all that to do so. But how do they make their case? They make their case entirely around the number of workers they're hiring, the amount they're trying to invest in their workers. A lot of people will not give them credit for that. They'll look more towards a company like Starbucks, for instance, is maybe a better example of a massive global corporation that has more of a legitimate, authentic commitment to its workers with things like the education credits they give to all of their baristas. But I would say where you take a stand on those issues comes down a little bit to values. Values also is tempered by my other economic considerations. So there's a great book, The Myth of the Ethical Consumer, that goes through, I can quote you all these surveys about how consumers say, oh, I care about sustainable brands. I'm willing to pay up for a sustainable company. But when it comes down to it, if I'm in the supermarket aisle, how much does that actually dictate which product I buy? Will I pay up for a fair trade certified chocolate bar or not? All these things are balanced against each other. It's not that moral or environmental concerns override everything else. But at least in my case, I think increasingly for people of my generation younger and increasingly generations older, people are saying these values that already dictate my political decisions are also going to start dictating the way I shop, the way I invest, and where I work. That last one is especially important because that's what's going to determine which companies are successful at recruiting, retaining, maintaining, and motivating top talent, is which corporations can prove to their employees that they stand for something more than just enrichment of their shareholders.
This is a really interesting topic because I have a hard time. I try to think, what's the end game? What does it look like? If I listen to you and you sound extremely sincere and earnest, and I think your work reflects that, but ultimately it sounds like in the future we'll only have one party in America.
I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, for many reasons, but I think foremost among them, I have to be honest that when I advocate bringing value, reintegrating your moral and economic lives, that cuts both ways. That's both people who agree with my set of values and people who disagree. I have to be willing, all people as part of my movement, I don't think many people talk about this, but everyone who's part of this movement to bring purpose into corporations, to bring ESG into investing, everyone has to be willing to accept that that might mean you have more Chick-fil-A's in the world than you had before. That the moment we realize that there is no moral neutrality, there is no value neutral way to go out the economy, that's going to mean there's going to be more corporations that are saying on religious grounds, we don't want to provide birth control to our employees, just as there's going to be more corporations that say we're going to be investing in our employees non-religious grounds.
Some days I just want to buy a hamburger. I don't want to think about birth control. I just want to eat the damn hamburger on a Sunday afternoon in a drive-in at McDonald's, and I don't want to have to think about whatever political.
And we speak from some positions of privilege. I mean, a lot of people, 4 out of 5 people live paycheck to paycheck. 2 out of 5 people can't come up with $400 in emergency. The idea that you can go around and start saying, oh, I'm only going to shop at a farmer's market or I only buy local, that's a real privilege. But one thing we tried to do in the book is to write out, for people who do have the privilege of having money, time, interest to be focused on these things, it doesn't mean that every single last decision has to be this whole large pro-con moral philosophy treatise to figure out what you have to do. In reality, almost all of our economic power ends up showing up in a few small decisions we make every year. Rather than going down the supermarket aisle and trying to pick between 2 different types of non-GMO organic corn chips, you can make the decision of, if I have the option, which supermarket do I shop at? Maybe a better example is, probably your listeners are very different, but for most people in their 401k, in their retirement accounts, for people who have that, how often they decide which funds to invest in? Very, very rarely. I mean, some of the best investing advice for those sorts of folks would be to make that decision once a year at most. For them, you can put in the work to say, do I want to invest in this ESG-oriented fund or not? Which fund actually represents what I care about and the sorts of companies I want to be a part owner of? You make that decision once. You don't have to think about that all the time. You can think about that once a year at most.
I'm thinking of, you brought up Gannett, and I think Gannett, from my understanding, swings politically one way. But let's face it, down the middle, we can look at most large corporations in America that deliver media, and there is a very clear political bias. So these are corporations that are in everyone's retirement accounts, et cetera. People choose with their feet. Some people want to watch Chris Cuomo. Some people want to watch Tucker Carlson. If you're an alien coming to America and you watch those two shows on the same day about the same subject, you're literally going to hear something that doesn't make any sense because you would think they're both living on a different planet. I get back to my comment at the very beginning, the separate but equal. I do wonder, since I see the word citizen in your title, I do wonder about the citizen responsibility that if we go down this path of saying, that guy Chick-fil-A, he's got these religious positions that I disagree with, I'm not going to support him, or I'm going to picket him. If there's a chance for a riot, I'm going to burn a Chick-fil-A. Who knows whatever's going to happen in crazy America. I just wonder, how can we not escape more and more division? If everything is going to be a values/political choice, God, man, it just seems like people are going to be constantly judging and constantly picking fights. And I just wonder if it'll be so smooth.
Here's what we mean by citizen capitalism. There's two ideas, two ways of thinking about voting. When you go into the voting booth, you can either think about, I'm voting out of my own personal best interest. What tax policies or welfare policies are going to most benefit me? Or you can go into the voting booth and say, what do I think is best for the country? And that might benefit me or might hurt me. If you look at the voting data from, I think the most recent that I saw was 2012, though I would guess it's the same in 2016, and you look at what ticket do people vote. And in general, if you were to say broad caricature, wealthy people, they want lower taxes, they vote Republican. Poor people want more welfare, they vote Democrat. In reality, 30-40% of people making above $250,000 vote Democrat, and 30-40% of people making below $20,000 or $30,000 are voting Republican.
It's philosophy. They've got philosophies.
They've got philosophies. What do we mean by citizen capitalism? I think all we mean is to say that right now we've bought into this ideology that markets are amoral, that somehow the economic realm, when we talk about capitalism, that is an amoral, value-neutral realm. I think increasingly people are starting to recognize that though we've all collectively bought into that myth over the last half century, that's no longer true. And that the Harvard Endowment cannot pretend that it is not making a values-based decision when it decides whether it should or should not be invested in ExxonMobil. All we mean by citizen capitalism is that as we exist in capitalism as buyers and consumers and employees, investors and savers and all else, that we were thinking as citizens, that we were doing so based off of what we think is best according to our own value set, not just for our own pocketbook, but for our conception of what capitalism should look like in America. And I think we can essentially aspire to something greater than just these homo economicus running around trying to maximize our own self-interest, because that's not who we are. If you do economics games and you try and test exactly how economically rational are people, 2/3 of the time we do things that are pro-social. They're not just purely in our own self-interest. And there's been a disconnect in how we built our economy to reflect that.
I hope all of these issues that you address, I enjoy this conversation. I enjoy the back and forth. And for all we both know, we could be on the same side or not the same side. I don't know, but I think we've both done a good job of kind of getting people to think about these issues. You did bring up something earlier. I don't know that this is a defense, but it's my hope for the avoidance of hypocrisy. What I mean by that is growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, I got to observe in my youth the winning of 3 Super Bowls by my hometown Washington Redskins, soon to be who knows what next. But I sure hope, because the Redskins, as you mentioned, were pressured, and they were pressured to change. That pressure to change most likely came from a particular partisan side of America. And I think that's fair. It's fair if that partisan side says, you know what, that name is a really racist name. It should have been gone a long time ago. Get rid of it. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. The owner of the Redskins, who I don't care for because I think he's ruined the team, he all of a sudden has to listen, or his billions and billions of value are going to drop a little bit. That long setup, here's where I want to go. It does frighten me a little bit, though, on the hypocrisy side, that same group is not using all of their media power, etc., to force the name of Yale, named after a slave trader, immediately. Why is it not all on the damn table? The biggest problem I have with all of this is going to be the hypocrisy. Because if the Washington Redskins go, racist term, then the slave trader that Yale's named after, I mean, I'm sitting here with my hands going up and down right now going, okay, hypocrisy level 1,000,000. I mean, so I think we've got to get to a point, if we're going to play this cleanup game, and fair enough, a lot of things can be cleaned up, then damn it, let's clean it all up.
The hypocrisy point is a great one because one of the things that was most infuriating about researching this book was how much kind of hollow talk there is in this broader space. People who preach the gospel of corporate social responsibility, but without backing it up with action. In many ways, I feel like we've won the battle of ideas, but have lost the war of substantive action. Where if you ask CEOs today, is it important to serve all your stakeholders, not just your shareholders? 9 in 10 will say yes. If you ask them, are you satisfied with the job you're already doing to do so? 96% will say, yes, I'm already doing a great job in serving all of my stakeholders, which does not reflect, I think, the way that we would look at it from the outside. A big part of our solution is how do we hold corporations, ultimately, how do we hold all organizations, institutions, government, media, and on, how do we hold them accountable to the set of values?
How do we hold the people accountable to hypocrisy too? If we're just defending our side, but we're hypocritical as hell, then that causes the other side to just go, what the hell? This is a mess.
And I think done halfway, a lot of these things breed more cynicism.
There you go.
Than they do success.
For sure, 100%. Hey, I love the conversation. We could probably go on for hours like this. The book, Accountable, The Rise of Citizen Capitalism. Hey, it's a conversation starter. I'm sure that's what your objective was and is. And I give you credit because I tried to see if I could break you here and there. You're not easy to break. You're well-researched on all sides of the coin.
Well, I come from the financial world where there is plenty of skepticism and cynicism on these subjects.
But I mean, that's good because I think, look, some people on these particular topics are going to get too fragile. If you're going to open the can up, if you're going to open up the can of worms, fragility is not going to solve it. I mean, you got to have a robust spine to take all shots.
And I think you have to be able to coordinate across a lot of different groups of people, especially as we look at how do you change Fortune 500 companies. If something is broken about our economy, it has to be something broken about our largest companies. That's just the way our economy works, is driven by these massive, massive corporations. And you cannot change them without coordinating with others. You look at like the Gannett shareholder vote, that required the coordination of millions and millions and millions of shares. No progress will be made unless you can kind of reach across ideological divides, reach across generations, reach across different sort of stakeholder groups, trying to eventually realize an economy that better reflects our values. Coming back to that term.
My biggest thing I worry about is probably the first thing I brought up. I do worry about the separate but equal because I think we're definitely on that trend. I understand it, and you make a lot of strong reasons why people can vote their values, their politics, about their economic values and politics, and I get it. I just hope that doesn't cause ultimately two countries.
I guess here's the two paths we can go in. I think if you look at the media industry, I think you're right, that it's led to this polarization. If you go all the way back into history, when there's a single paper that dominated a whole city, there's some amount of moderation that had to happen so they could generally have their entire city represented, all the views of their city represented in their paper. And the polarization of the media has led to this separate equal as a charged term because it's got a different history, but it's led to these kind of divergent paths within the industry. I think the other example I might point to that might be a better vision for where this could all lead is with organic food. The largest retailer of organic food in America right now is Walmart. Walmart did not get there because of charges from one faction or another. They got there because they realized that in general, organic food was going to be better for the world, better for their consumers, better for drawing in ultimately their own revenue and profits than not. And I would not say that was an overly political decision. In many ways, that was not even a very values-focused decision. It was a decision based off of the facts of what are the impacts of different sorts of food and what do consumers want.
Great stuff, Michael. Again, the book, Accountable, The Rise of Citizen Capitalism. Hey, is there a website we can direct people to? Where would you like to send them?
Yes, accountablethebook.com.
Accountablethebook.com. Hey, cool stuff. Keep me posted. Like I said, we probably could have gone down this path for hours and hours. And I give you credit again. I think that you've got this well thought out as a conversation topic, conversation opener, because I have seen some people that they come into this kind of a realm and they have such a partisan pull that they can't swing to the other side. And you seem to do a very good job of seeing all facets of this. So congratulations.
The one thing we know is this debate is only beginning.
Well, good luck, sir. Take care, man.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.